Hi, I'm Steve Green. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at working with large data sets. And what I mean by a large data set is that the maximum number of records in a query expression that the platform will return is 5,000. I believe that can be altered in the registry somewhere. Only for on-premise though. Online you would have that 5,000 record maximum page limit. And also it's not necessarily a good idea to retrieve record sets of that size, especially if you're retrieving a large number of columns, because obviously the overhead in memory on the server back end, if you're using those records in plugins or workflows, could be substantial. So what we've got here is Visual Studio open. Obviously from some of my previous videos you've seen me working on this CRM demo solution, so I'll open that. Whilst that's opening, what we're looking to do is on the account record, once that opens, I've got a number of contacts field, and on an update of an account, what we'll do is we'll have a plugin that will go and retrieve any associated contacts, take a count of that number of contacts and update this field. I wouldn't ordinarily recommend you to do something like this within a plugin, because it's potentially a long-running process depending on the size of the database, and plugins have a 2-minute time limit, at which point the platform will terminate the process and you'll get an exception. And also it wouldn't be a good practice in production to be doing querying of large number of records in a plugin. It's typically something you do asynchronously, because it's not part of the sort of business logic validation of this form or any sort of business rules. It's something that could happen 10 seconds later, 30 seconds later. It's not critical to know. That's up to the second accurate when you save this record, and that's obviously what a plugin is designed for, is synchronous changes. So if I just take you over to the contacts entity, I've imported from a sample database a large number of contacts, and they're all associated to this CRM demo account. So we can see there's 5,000 plus is as much as the platform will tell us. Obviously if I click on individual letters, you can see there's several hundred, if not thousands, within each. So what we need to do is create a new plugin. So right click the plugins project, add new item, it's a class library, and we'll call it number of contacts associated, or something like associated. And again, as you've seen in a couple of my other previous videos, just the empty shell. We need to add a couple of CRM namespace references. We know we're going to be working with a query expression for the first part, and in the latter part I'll show you how to do it with LINQ. So if I add those two namespaces, we've already got the system.link. I think in one of my previous videos I added it a second time by mistake. So change the access modifier, implement iPlugin, that creates, if I right click and implement, produces this execute method. And then what we can do, obviously from the previous video that was a two-parter, we created this total service values plugin. Again, I can take, if I'll take all the code from within, okay, and obviously this will be, again, it's on an account. We won't be registering it on the create because obviously you won't have any associated contacts, so we can remove that section of the code. So it's just on an update message. It's going to be on the account again, as we've just stated, and then from here down I'll remove this previous code. Oh, I think I've missed the catch blocks. Okay, and again, system.service model. So we're back to kind of how I typically start a lot of my plugins. What we will remove is we did this pre-entity image in that previous example, but won't be using that. So okay, so that's back to now a typical structure for a plugin. So what we can do is I'll go through this reasonably quickly because I've done it in a couple of other videos, so I don't want to waste your time. So we need to copy this plugin element in the register file again. We can remove the steps, call it calculate number of contacts. Take the class name, okay, that should now register with the platform. Just pop it on pause. Okay, that took significantly longer than normal. The reason was I've added a couple of fields which have shown you the number of contacts, which I regenerated the early bound class library at the same time, but it didn't like that and threw an error on deployment. But now you can see it's got the GUID as we expect. And if I quickly dive into the solution, under the plugins, we've now got our calculate number of contacts. So now if I register the step, so expand CRM Explorer, expand plugin assemblies, expand our plugin, and new plugins available, add step, it's going to be on the account, so click that. Wait for it to retrieve on an update, and again, because we want to update, I explained it in a previous couple of videos that we'll do it pre-operation so that we can just update the field and let the platform, so add it to the entities attribute collection and let the platform write that to the database. And what we'll do, as I previously stated, it's important to filter these just to the fields you require. So deselect, find our number of contacts. That's the only. What we'll do is, the way we'll trigger this is when that number of contacts field, we'll filter on the number of contacts field changing. I was just trying to think if that was going to cause a recursive loop, because that's the field we're going to be updating in the plugin. But what we'll be doing is we'll only do the calculation and retrieve the results if that's null. So obviously if we update the value in a subsequent update and write to that update that entity, that value will then contain something from our calculation, so it should just end the process. So not ideal logic, but this is a typical business process. Obviously we don't need any pre or post images, so if we OK that, oh, sorry, I didn't show that additional step had been created. Likewise in the register file, so I'll deploy again, pause it. Okay, so that's now deployed. So if I quickly check, SDK message processing steps. Should now have our number of contacts pre-account update step. So that's okay. So now to the plugin logic. Obviously, as I just stated, when we've registered that update message, which is why this is a bit of a flawed logic, I've triggered it on the field that we're going to be updating. But obviously I only want this to do the update if that field has been blanked. So if someone deletes the content, the platform would go away, retrieve all the contacts, do a count, and update the field, and then that subsequent update should be fine, although it won't technically be an update because it'll be passed in as part of the pipeline. But anyway, here we go. So we need to start by doing a query expression. So we need to do the conditions. So condition for contacts, we're going to be querying the contact entity. New condition expression. We've got our early bound types. We don't have to. Normally, you'd have to put something like contact as a string, the logical name, but you could misspell it. So if we use the early bound, entity logical name property. So sorry, this is the attribute, sorry. This is the attribute we're going to be querying, so we want to query the contacts where the parent customer ID is equal to the account that we're updating. So, sorry, this is where you have to know the field names. I mean, fairly easy to find them. If I go to our solution, expand contacts, look at the fields list. So to find the parent customer, we've got this parent customer display name on the form, and it's parent customer ID, all lowercase, is the logical name. And then you can see how that differs to the schema name, where it's capitalized in certain places. So I'll have to use the logical name, condition operator equal, and then the value, which will be the account, which I haven't casted yet, sorry. Getting ahead of myself. So we need to cast the entity, which is the account that triggered the plugin, and it comes in as part of the context that we extract from the input parameters. We cast that to the early bound type. So current account equals entity dot to entity. So now we've got the early bound type. We can use that to extract the ID property. So that's our only criteria we're interested in. And now we need to build the query expression. Because new query expression, give it this is where, sorry, I did in the earlier step I was doing the entity name. This is where typically you'd have done contact as a string, but we'll do the contact entity logical name. So then we need to define the column set, and as I've previously stated, if I did a true, that's every column on a contact, which is pretty inefficient because there's behind the scenes there's probably a lot of ones that aren't even present on the form, but there's a lot of columns on a contact record. So we just need to, because we're only going to be doing a count, we only need a simple single value. We could do a count on the IDs. Well, the records that come back will just be doing a count on the entity collection, but we only need a simple single field that we know will have a fairly simple data type. So something like the created on date. We're not actually going to be using this field. It's just to minimize the number of fields that get retrieved by the platform, to keep the in-memory data to a minimum. So QE contact, add the condition, and we're ready to go. So now we need to do an entity collection to retrieve the results into. So entity collection results even, using the organization service retrieve multiple method, pass in our query expression. So that will now query all the contacts where the parent customer ID is equal to the account where we've just updated that number of contacts field. And then we can do a count of that entity collection and write that into the field. So on the current account, that new FSO number, oh sorry, I didn't actually replace the what I generated whilst I was pausing the video. I didn't actually add that. So in my SDK bin folder, again an updated version today, 15 minutes ago. Added that in. Now that should have the IntelliSense of the new field. So again, if you're doing this on your own system and you add an additional field, remember to do the CRM service util, which you can see in a previous video, to regenerate your early bound class. So now the number of contacts equals results.entities.count. And then we can allow the platform to submit that on the, because it's a pre-operation. And now I'll show you the problem with that. So just pop it on pause. Okay, that's deployed. Yeah, so now I'll show you what will happen when we change that field, how it will go off, query all of the contacts and update that field. I haven't actually done the if condition to say only if it's null, so this will actually happen every time I change the value to anything. Which, I mean, they say the business logic's it's not a very good solution anyway. But open CRM demo account. We know there's thousands of records in the system. Now you'll see the plugin fire, and there may be a substantial delay as it goes off and retrieves all of those records, which is why this shouldn't be done really in a plugin, because it could potentially time out if you had hundreds of thousands. So as you can see, now we're under the false impression we've got 5,000 contacts associated to CRM demo account, and if you weren't aware that the standard maximum record return limit is 5,000 for a query expression, you'd think that was correct. But the way we have to get around that is using pages. So how we do that is, before the retrieve multiple, as part of the query expression, I've just copied and pasted this in to save me typing it all out manually. So we create a new paging info, we define the number of records we wish to retrieve in each page. Obviously that's down to your sort of judgment, what you feel the platform could handle, up to a maximum obviously of 5,000, but if there was a lot of rows and there was hundreds of users on your server, you might not want to be retrieving 5,000 record chunks because of the memory usage. So it's finding a bit of a balance that you're not doing repeated calls to the platform for only, say, 50 records, or you're not overwhelming the server by using up a lot of memory by calling 5,000 with 300 columns retrieved, or all the columns retrieved. So if we say 1,000, obviously the initial page number is 1. We initially, we don't want a paging cookie, because the retrieve will have a paging cookie for the next set of results if there's more, which we will read back in further down. And obviously there's a property for whether you want to return the total record count. I'm not 100% certain whether that actually works, that if you do set it to true, you do get a true count beforehand. So now we need to set up a while loop prior to the retrieval of the first page of results. And we're going to set this up as though it would be an infinite loop. So what that would do would just keep infinitely retrieving the same set of results over and over again until the platform killed the process. but we need to do a check if results is not equal to null. So not equal to null, then just paste that in for speed. The total records, we add the count, what we've just retrieved for that page, do a check if there's more records, so there's this boolean that they retrieve multiple when we only retrieve, so we can check if that's true. If it is, we increment the page number, retrieve the paging cookie that came back from that set of results, so that you know when we pass that into the query, into retrieve multiple again, it knows where it got to and it retrieves the next page and the next page, and if that more records equals false, then we can break out and then update the number of contacts with the total records, and that'll just pass that through to the main database operation. So we can deploy that again. What I'll do before that is I'll just remove from the register file. I've removed from the register file the workflow solution section. So under the solutions area before that, there was the workflow element, just so it speeds up the deployment. So let's pop it on pause. Sorry. The reason I removed that element from the XML is so it stops it deploying the workflow solution. But obviously be careful of doing that in production. Make sure if you were to do that, you were to save that syntax, that XML, somewhere, or have a previous version checked into TFS, because otherwise you'd have to recreate. Well, if you were to try and redeploy, the GUID is obviously relevant with the platform. If you've registered that workflow in your actual out-the-box workflows, you've used your assembly, you might have a bit of a headache. So, but anyway, I digress. So now our code has been altered and deployed to work in pages. So if we go back to the account record and now we change this, it would trigger our plugin on the update to go and query all the contacts and update this field. But doing it in pages of 1,000, iterating through them. Well, sorry, it doesn't iterate through the results, but it keeps retrieving each page and totaling up the number of the count of each record. So now, rather than the 5,000, we can now see the total number of contacts in the system associated to CRM demo account is nearly 17,748. So that's using query expressions to do that. What I can show you now is how to use the link provider with the early bound class that we generated, because that actually handles the paging behind the scenes, and I'll show you that working. So we can comment out all of our loop. So we've commented the condition expression, the query expression, the paging info, the while loop, and then where it created the, oops, I've gone slightly too far. So now I need to instantiate the organization service context, and as I've said before, I typically do this inside a using statement, so that obviously in this example where we're tracking 17,000 records, if we, obviously when it falls out of scope, it should quite quickly be garbage collected, but I don't know how, I'm not ever analysed a garbage collector, but I'd rather know that those 17,000 records that have been tracked have been released from memory the moment this using statement drops out of scope. So CRM demo context, pass in the organisation service reference, and now we can do our query. So var contacts equal from contacts in the contact set. So you'll find there's a data set for every entity, including custom ones. Obviously, if you've regenerated the early bound class, that is, since you created your custom entity, where the parent cts dot parent customer ID equals the current account ID. Again, that's an entity reference. So I can either, two options, take the early bound entity type and do a two entity reference, or filter on the ID. It might be safer to do it as a two entity reference here, just in case there's ever a chance for a matching GUID on the contact and account, which I think is virtually impossible, but anyway. And then similar, we want to restrict the number of fields we retrieve, so we'll generate a new contact record, close off the end of the link statement, and now we need to define what fields we want, so we'll do similar, where the created on equals the created on. So that will now do a link query. Didn't do. Oh, sorry, I can't use create on in this instance because I'm actually trying to create a new contact record from this retrieval and define the created on, which is a read-only property. So if we just said, I mean, we're only going to use it for account, so we could use middle name. Okay, so that's something we can write to, but we're not actually going to be saving these contacts back to the database. We're just using them to get a count of the records. So now that will handle it differently to a query expression where we don't have to worry about the paging. So now I can set the number of not number of employees, sorry, number of contacts equal to the contacts. And what you'll need to do, that count isn't the count property. I typically would create a list, use the toList method, and then that does have a count property. And that should be the equivalent of having to iterate through and create these paging cookies and so on. The link provider handles that all behind the scenes, and so if we repeat that, well, let me just deploy. Where this is going to differ, however, is that rather than that iterating through in chunks of 1,000 and adding to a total, this will now go away and actually build a collection that will contain all 17,000, well, nearly 18,000 records, which could be a big overhead on the server. So if I go to our demo account, change that, this will now trigger our update with our link query. So that's a same end result, but obviously that link provider made it a lot simpler than having to write all of that commented code to do the same. And now what we can talk about is how to work with pages of results with the link provider. So if you wanted to iterate through the results, actually doing process rather than just getting an overall count. So what we've got on the contact entity, I've put a contact number, as in the number, like a reference number within the system, that we could just obviously go through all the existing records and actually add the add a number sequentially. So what I'll do, I'll just add that to that view. So if we dump email address, just so for clarity on that view, we can see contact number, bring it across, make it a little bit wider. Okay, save and close, publish that. So back to our solution. So we could do the same. We could have done the same within this while loop for each set of results. We could have iterated through, rather than just adding on the counter. We could have done a for each loop, but we'll do something here where we're going to now iterate through these, but obviously we don't want to retrieve all 17,000 records. So what we'll do is we'll work with what's called take and skip. So you take so many records, or you skip so many, and then you take an amount, which is the same as paging. Obviously, they need to match because we need to skip in blocks of page number. So very similar. We need to do a while loop, but before we do the while loop, we start off with a counter of how many pages to skip. We don't want to skip the initial page, so we don't want any. So we want to take 1,000 records, and then we'll add to that in a counter. So while true, okay. So now we need to surround our query and then do a skip, pages to skip, times the page size, and then do a take. So this is how many records we'll actually take out of that collection, or ask the provider to supply, ask the link provider to supply, which will be the page size. So hopefully that makes sense. So we've defined the initial counter to be 0, so it won't skip any records because it'll be 1,000 times 0. So the first pass will be don't skip any, but take 1,000 records, and then we'll add to the pages. Just increment it by 1, that's the shorthand, so that'll just add 1 to that. So the next time we come through this while loop, it'll be incremented up by 1, so it'll skip 1,000 records or whatever that's up to, and then take 1,000. So for each contact in that contacts collection, we want to update that number. So contact dot contact number, or FSO, sorry, contact number equals, and what we needed to do, sorry, was have a counter of where we're at, and we'll start it at 1, so the first account in the system will be 1. Contact number equals 1. And what I will also add to this statement is an order by, so we do them in alphabetical order. So if we order them by the full name, the default is ascending. Obviously if you want descending, you have to put descending afterwards. So it will query them in pages of 1,000 in alphabetical order, and each one we will update the contact with the contact number. And we need to then increment that by 1. And what we need to also do is commit that change to the platform. In fact, actually, if we change, sorry, I'm trying not to confuse people, but if we make the property we're retrieving to be contact number,
it's the only property we want really, and we're going to alter that, or it doesn't have to be, otherwise we'd have just added an additional property as well as middle name, and then the save change, the update object and save changes would have written that back to the platform together. But obviously middle name we hadn't really altered, so we were unnecessarily adding it to the update message. But this will be a tiny bit more efficient. So we're retrieving the contact number. In every instance it will be null, but we're going to update it with this incremental value. And then we need to do a update object method that's part of the link provider, this organization service context. We need to say we want to, so it tracks the changes on the contact record that we've just made. So as we iterate through changing the contact number to this value, we track that change in the context, and once we've done all of those records, we have to commit them with a save changes. This is just something that this is the difference with the link provider and the query expression, where you would do just a service.update per record normally, but this is all tracked in a context, and you have to commit the changes at the end of the, so all 1000 records on the first page will get updated, and then it will commit the 1000 changes. And then the final, we need to create a counter of the total, like we did with the total records here. We also need to track that so that we can submit that at the end to this number of contacts on the account. So I need to also output that, or sorry, increment it. So total records plus equals so obviously this will add to it in blocks of 1000 until it gets to the final page. But what we need to do is our test of discovering whether it's complete is if the size of if the number of records there is less than 1000, we know we've hit the last page. So we don't need to do another loop. So if I do a check of the size of that final page of results, so this count is less than the page size, we know we've processed our final page because it's the remainder of the results. So we can just break out. And then we need to obviously take our total, obviously we've added to this total records, and write that into the field for the number of contacts. So we've kind of merged two bunches of logic, and I really wouldn't recommend you do this kind of bulk processing within a plugin, because I say you risk running into the 2-minute timeout and throwing exceptions, and the end user will be, and the end user being forced to wait whilst this processing happens synchronously. So just to recap, we've retrieved, set up the organization service context, define a page size, and obviously this initial page is to skip. We're going to, as we increment through the pages, so we're skipping and taking in pages of 1000, we're going to actually update the contact, and obviously as we finish each page of 1000 we save those changes, and then once we reach the final page we break out of the while loop and we update the number of contacts on the account. So let's deploy that. I've just deployed that, but I think I've spotted before I go and test this and it actually goes through updating records, I think there's a flaw in my logic. When you do a save changes, I believe it stops tracking those results. So obviously this contacts to list count may be 0. So I need to move this save changes down to here so that we actually add the count to the records and we can test on it. But also then, if we still need to be able to obviously work on this count. We can't save the changes prior to that. We need to also copy it into there, which is a bit messy, but I think that's the case. I mean, just to be sure, I'll redeploy. One other thing, sorry, before I deploy that, I think I need to also set the ID field, because otherwise it's going to see these as new contacts with new GUIDs, and we'll end up duplicating. Well, we'll have a bunch of contacts with no names, just a contact number. So that should retrieve just the contact with the ID and the contact number. Then when we iterate through and update the contact number and update the object, it matches the GUIDs. Okay, so let's give this a go. So just to quickly recap again, I'm going to go through in blocks of 1,000, update the contact number on the contact record and update the object, track it in the context, save the changes, and at the same time count up the number of records and then commit that back to the number of contacts on the account. So if I close that contact, now if we alter this again, just make it 17. This may be a little bit longer process because it's got to update contact records as well as counting them up. Let's just go to the contacts entity and refresh. So you can see it's putting the numbers in. If we could do that in reverse, yeah, the blank ones aren't gonna. So yeah, it's processing. It's still going, obviously, as you can see, and you'd be forcing the user to wait all this time, where they may think the system's actually crashed, because the plugin's still processing the records in the back end, which is why anything like this with bulk editing, bulk processing shouldn't be done synchronously. And then we run the risk now of this hitting the 2-minute limit if it doesn't update all of those contacts in time. We can actually find all the contacts where they don't have the number. You can see how busy the platform is, where contact number does not contain data. So you can still see there's over 5,000 to go. So there's a very real chance that you'll see this actually time out. There you go. So I don't know if there's anything to, yeah, there you go. Plugin execution failed because the operation is timed out at the sandbox client. I mean, it's the same, if you don't register it sandboxed, it's still the same 2-minute timeout. So that's proven my point as to why you ordinarily wouldn't do a long running process like that. And now, because it's thrown the exception, we didn't get to the final part of the code where it actually gave us the total back. But that pretty much covers off what I wanted to show you and how to handle large record sets, working with paging cookies for query expressions, how the fact that the LINQ provider can handle all that behind the scenes, but I wouldn't recommend you to retrieve that number of records even asynchronously. I don't think it's good practice to process everything, like to retrieve more into memory then process through them. I think you should split it down into workable units just to give the server a fighting chance. But
Thanks for listening. Any comments or requests, post them below.